Ratchet Clank Rift Apart, like many previous entries in the series, is a third-person shooter-based action-adventure game developed by Insomniac Games and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. The game released not even 1 year ago on June 11, 2021 for the PlayStation 5, and as one of the very first original PlayStation 5 exclusives, Ratchet Clank Rift Apart had a lot to live up to. Leading up to its launch, the developers showed off some amazing-looking gameplay and promised a true next-gen experience to fans, many of which stated with conviction in their hearts that this would be a game to make buying a PS5 worth it, even if it had to come from eBay. Well, did it live up to the hype? Is it really a console-selling game? Is Rivet a good character? We'll answer these questions and more here today, so without further ado, let's bolt on ahead and get right into it, shall we? First things first, let's talk about what happens when we start up the game for the first time. And as you might expect, the first thing we're greeted with when starting up Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is a title screen. But this isn't just any old title screen. There's big metal buildings, bright neon signs, and of course flying cars and spaceships. Wouldn't be a Ratchet & Clank game without them, right? The game tells us to press X to start, so we do, and then a menu comes up that lets us create a new file and adjust some basic settings like difficulty, graphics mode, controls, and so on. I of course played on the highest difficulty mode available, which I believe is called Renegade Legend, because I enjoy a challenging experience, but honestly it was a bit of a letdown. I was hoping for something a bit more punishing, with this being the highest difficulty level out of like 5. If I could have had it my way, every hit on Renegade Legend would have the potential to be lethal, but in reality it'll generally take around 4 to 5 hits without healing to kill you, which in my opinion is way too many. But getting back on track here, let's talk about graphics settings. I tried out all 3 options available to you, namely Fidelity Mode, Performance Mode, and Performance RT Mode, and in my opinion, Performance RT is the best option here. Fidelity looks great, but the low frame rate is a deal breaker for me, and while Performance does have a stable frame rate, you get a very similar result with Performance RT Mode, but with the added bonus of some ray tracing and other graphical upgrades here and there. To my eye, Performance RT looks and plays the best overall, but obviously that's just a personal choice. But with the major settings out of the way, we can finally start the game and we're literally dropped right in. The camera pans down into a vibrant futuristic city, and the intro cutscene begins. This is probably a good time to mention that, like most of my other reviews, this video is going to be pretty spoilerific, so if you don't want to get spoiled for the story, it might be a good idea to back out now. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's get back to the intro. So, oddly enough, the first character we see in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is neither Ratchet nor Clank. It's some random alien guy who's on the run from what appear to be the Yolkians from the Jimmy Neutron movie. If you get that reference, you get a gold star for the day. But anyway, after the Yolkians pass by while saying something about Resistance members, a Lombax wearing a robot disguise emerges from the sewers and begins sneaking her way up to a different group of small unsuspecting robots. She swipes what a voice in her helmet calls an infobot and quickly runs away. This riles up the bad guys, who begin to search the area, eventually coming upon our alien friend from the beginning of the cutscene. The Lombax sees this and valiantly jumps in to save the day, even giving up her disguise so the civilian can get home safely. This is of course where we find out the Lombax in the robot suit was one of this game's main heroes, Rivet, all along. The civilian thanks Rivet for her help, to which she gives a quick wink before hightailing it out of there. We see Rivet run past a wanted poster of herself hanging on a wall, hinting that she is in fact a member of the Resistance, and immediately following this, Rivet is surrounded on all sides by Yolkians. The scene then transitions to Ratchet and Clank getting ready to go out to a celebration of their heroism, but Ratchet's having second thoughts. He's afraid they might not be worthy of the praise, but Clank reassures him everything will be fine, and the two head out to be greeted by the crowd. Captain Quark, Skid McMarks, and Rusty Pete, 3 characters from previous games, announce their arrival and the celebration begins. And by celebration I mean tutorial, because this is where they teach you all the basics of the game. It's a fun tutorial as far as tutorials go, but the fun doesn't really start until the enemies show up and you finally get yourself a gun. You find out that someone's put a bounty on your heads, and that's why the parade's under attack, but you don't know who's responsible. The enemies keep coming as you make your way through the many unique floats of the parade, eventually culminating in a gauntlet-type battle against a bunch of enemies and their dropship. This fight takes a little while to get through, seeing as you only have the burst pistol at this point in the game, but we make do. Once all the enemies are cleaned up, Ratchet and Clank finally get to the main stage, where Clank has a special surprise for Ratchet. He has rebuilt the Dimensionator, a device seen in previous Ratchet & Clank games that has the power to open up rifts to other dimensions. According to Clank, he rebuilt it so Ratchet could use its dimensional powers to find the other Lombaxes that are spread out across the dimensions. Ratchet seems to have some reservations about this, but before he can say anything, Dr. Nefarious swoops in and steals the Dimensionator for himself. He tries to get the device to work, but ends up just summoning an otherworldly fish to their dimension. Nefarious flies off, taking the stage his ship was tethered to with him, and we're back to gameplay. The game now teaches us how to rail grind, which, if you're a fan of early 2000s PlayStation games, is always a good time. And we make our way to an open area where we can buy some guns from Ms. Zircon, the shop of sorts for this Ratchet & Clank game. We buy the Enforcer because why wouldn't you? And we're back to killing goons. Eventually, we meet up with Dr. Nefarious again, and he tries to activate the Dimensionator once more. Ratchet, seeing no other way, shoots the core of the Dimensionator, which sends the device out of control, opening rifts to random dimensions all over the place, which is probably worse than whatever Nefarious was planning. After this, there's a long sequence of battle after battle, until we finally reach the first boss fight with Dr. Nefarious. It's an alright fight, but with the very limited arsenal of weapons at your disposal in the beginning of the game, you basically have to rely on the burst pistol for the majority of the fight, which is kinda boring in my opinion. But anyway, when you beat him, Dr. Nefarious says he's taking us to a dimension where he always wins, before opening up one final rift. We're sucked in, and the scene you've probably seen many times already, even if you haven't played the game, begins. You know the one. Ratchet & Clank falling from dimension to dimension, eventually arriving in the city where we met Rivet earlier in the intro, and yes, this is still the intro to the game. Ratchet, Clank, and Dr. Nefarious all find themselves together in this odd city. They start to get up. Ratchet says a one-liner out of nowhere that definitely won't come back at the end of the game, goes to hit Nefarious, and the Dimensionator explodes, causing even further damage to the dimensions and taking out Clank's arm. Rivet then picks up Clank because she has some questions about everything that's going on, and Nefarious is teleported to a room full of statues of himself. Apparently this really is a dimension where he always comes out on top. The Doctor is greeted by his assistant who we saw earlier with the name Emperor Nefarious. The two then awkwardly laugh maniacally, and the title card for the game finally appears, ending what I would consider to be the intro to the game. Now, as you probably already understand based on how long that description was, this is a really long intro for a game. It's probably around 30 minutes to an hour depending on the difficulty you choose, and in my opinion that is way too long. I mean, that's more than half as long as some movies. I get that they had to set up 2 characters, and that can take a while, but did you really need to have that many fights before the title card? You fight 2 bosses for crying out loud. Call me old-fashioned, but just give me a 5 to 10 minute cutscene setting everything up, and I'm good. I do like the idea of making the intro to the game what amounts to a playable cutscene that also functions as a tutorial, but it just needed to be cut a little bit so you're not like, wow, that was still the intro when the title card comes up. But maybe I'm being too harsh. It was a really fun intro, and I remember enjoying it very much. So I'd say overall, it's a good intro, but just a tad too long. But okay, now that we got the intro out of the way, finally, let's talk about the story in a more general sense. So, like most other mainline Ratchet & Clank games, the story of Rift Apart is split up over a number of planets that you'll have to visit for various reasons, sometimes returning to an old planet if the story calls for it. I like this system. It allows developers to really go crazy with different planet designs, characters, side stories, and so on, and still weave everything together into a cohesive story. For a game that's so story-centric like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, this is something that can't be made to work without a system like this. You can't just make it so that halfway through Ghost of Tsushima, Jin goes to the moon to fight moon ghouls. That doesn't work cohesively with the story and flow of that game, but with Ratchet & Clank we can go to a hyper-futuristic city, a prehistoric jungle, a vast wasteland, and a pirate bay, and that all makes perfect sense with the story because we have this system where we travel from planet to planet. It's very smart. But before we move on, let me just say that I do in fact like the overall story of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. It's a really fun little romp through space, and I had a great time with it. However, I do have a lot of problems with specific aspects of the story that I think you should be made aware of. First of all, Rivet. She's an enjoyable character for most of the game, and does a good job fitting in with the other characters, but my issue with her is that, at least for me, I didn't have any real emotional attachment to her throughout the entire game, because she just kinda shows up out of nowhere without any build-up, and has never given any substantial backstory. All we know about her is that she's a member of the Resistance Against Nefarious, that in and of itself also has very little depth to it. She grew up on Sargasso with the Mort hive mind, and she lost her arm. That's it. We don't know what her motivations are other than must beat bad guy. We don't know the things she's been through that led her up to this point. We don't even really get a good feeling for her relationships with the other main characters in her dimension, except for a select few. There's a lot left up to the player to fill in with their own headcanon, and normally I wouldn't mind that, but this game is clearly trying to be a very story-driven experience, which is why it bugs me so much how little we know. And don't even get me started on Rivet's relationship with Kit, her dimension's version of Clank. They're all buddy-buddy, albeit a little awkward when they first team up, but once Rivet finds out it was Kit's fault she lost her arm, she's completely disgusted by her, even though Kit clearly regrets what she did very much and genuinely apologizes to Rivet. It seems so out of character for someone who was supposed to be the hero of this dimension, like Ratchet is the hero of his. She does eventually come around with a little convincing, but then flies off the handle at Kit again when she, rightfully so, loses her will to fight after how uncharacteristically hurt Rivet was when she learned the truth about her arm. Once again, this just made no sense to me, and was extremely corny. The developers clearly just wanted a way to have Kit swoop in at the end of the game to save the day, to further complete the stereotypical Marvel movie style of story they were going for, which is another thing that didn't really click with me personally. If you like a very predictable, one-liner filled superhero-style story, you'll most likely love Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. However, for me, the predictability and overall cheesiness of the game was not a highlight to say the least. So many times I would say things like, I wonder if this guy's gonna show up, and of course he would. I personally like to be surprised and taken with my guard down when it comes to storytelling because, for me, a story I can predict exactly where it's going is rather boring. One other quick note on cheesiness. Was it really necessary to have Ratchet or Rivet go, whoa, 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 in every single cutscene or stage story spectacle moment? It happens so much throughout the game. So much that I thought it was relevant enough to include in a review. It's obviously not a huge problem, but it did get annoying after like the 10th time, so I figured I'd mention it here. But alright, before we talk about my biggest problem with the story, let's go over something that I really enjoyed about it, and that happens to be the relationship between Ratchet and Kit. It's super wholesome. The two meet relatively early on in the game, and seeing how Kit is very tentative to team up with someone due to her past, and how Ratchet slowly gets her to come around, was very heartwarming. It's honestly what the relationship between Rivet and Kit should have been like. Heck, even after Kit almost blows Ratchet's head off, he still wants to be partners with her. Does that remind you of anything? Of course, he didn't actually get hurt like Rivet did, but still, this is the type of big-hearted gesture of unconditional trust that you'd expect from a hero like Ratchet or Rivet. And the two go on to have a great time together, and I genuinely enjoyed their dynamic quite a bit. Personally, I even liked it better than Ratchet and Clank's relationship in this game. Okay, now for the big issue here. The elephant in the room, if you will. The length of the game. Playing on Renegade Legend, it took me somewhere between 10 and 15 hours to beat the entire game, including all the side stuff like the arena and the side quests, which obviously is not very long for a game that costs $70 retail. But the cost of the game is not the real issue I have here. It's that since your game is so short, you easily could have extended it by a few hours to give us more of a complete picture of Rivet and her universe. There was plenty of time for a decently long backstory, but we just didn't get that. Not to mention the fact that besides the main heroes, no one really gets much screen time. I would have loved to see more Captain Quantum, Skid, and the rest of the Resistance. You didn't even need to make new areas. You could have just had each character have a side quest or two on each planet, and we learn about them that way. But what we got was each Resistance member showing up maybe twice throughout the entire story, and playing very forgettable roles. If I had to guess, the cause of the length issue was probably something with Sony wanting the game out relatively close to the PS5's launch, but that still doesn't excuse it. Alright, now let's talk about the combat, which I absolutely love. So, since this is a third-person shooter game, we're obviously going to be shooting enemies and getting shot at when it comes to combat. However, unlike many other shooters, Ratchet & Clank does that thing where bullets move somewhat slowly, and you can see each individual bullet. Not only do I genuinely adore the way this looks and the effect it has, I also really enjoy the unique gameplay style this brings to the experience. Since most of the enemy bullets are rather slow-moving, you as the player have the ability to bob and weave in order to avoid them, which in my opinion is great fun. It's like a slightly less hard version of a Danmaku or Bullet Hell game, but in 3D. It's great, and it makes the combat so much better than the hide behind cover, peek out, shoot, hide behind cover, peek out, shoot style of gameplay that some other shooters go for, in my opinion. Add on top of that things like melee enemies, flying enemies, and snipers, and you've got yourself a really fun and varied combat loop. And just to make things even more interesting, we also have the ability to use a plethora of unique weapons that all have their own strengths and weaknesses. This is another staple of the Ratchet & Clank franchise that I find very appealing. Picking and choosing what weapon to use in each scenario to best defeat the enemies I'm dealing with is an extremely rewarding experience. Of course, you could just use whatever weapon you happen to randomly pick and still probably have a lot of fun, but for me, the strategy and planning aspect of this system is my favorite part. But just when you thought Insomniac couldn't throw any more variation into the combat, they give you the weapon upgrade system. Essentially, you collect a resource called Raritanium, and you use that to upgrade your weapons to make them even stronger and more unique. I remember so many times throughout the story where I'd go to Miss Zircon to upgrade my weapons and think, ooh, that sounds good, when I'd see the possible upgrades. They do actually make a pretty distinguishable difference in your combat ability, and that's something I'd really like to praise the developers on. So many games with similar upgrade systems make the upgrades basically barely matter at all, but in Rift Apart I always felt like I was getting stronger with each upgrade, which is a great feeling. The only thing I wish was a little bit different was the fact that you could basically get everything if you so desired. When it comes to skill trees, I personally prefer to have to make a choice between one upgrade or another when I'm making a build, because I feel more like my choices matter, and the build I made is more personal to me, but that's not really a major issue. Another thing I really like about the weapon system is when you reach level 5, I believe, every weapon evolves into a better version of itself. This makes leveling the weapons so much more fun because you really want to see what they're going to be like when they evolve. They're not all super big changes, but they're still fun to collect and test out. However, I was pretty disappointed that when you play Challenge Mode, or this game's version of New Game Plus, leveling your guns to level 10 doesn't evolve them again. They just get slightly stronger and a few more upgrades. It's fine as far as things go, but I really would have liked a bigger reward for getting a gun to max level. And next, kind of going along with combat, we have the enemies. Now, I really like the enemy designs in Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. They're all so unique and fun, and they bring so much to the experience. The animations in particular are very nice. Everyone's so bouncy and full of life, and I love that. However, there is one glaring issue with enemies in this game, and that is the variety. You'll be fighting the same 3 or 4 factions of enemies throughout the entire game, and that was a bit of a letdown for me personally. Especially when it came to the mini-bosses, because it was just so noticeable. You fight the same 3 mini-bosses like 5 times each, so every time a big boss is coming up, you're just like, oh, it's going to be the Juggernaut guy again, isn't it? And that stinks. I would have loved for each mini-boss encounter to be completely new and separate from all other bosses, and I feel like that would have made the fights more memorable and impactful. Once again, I assume this comes down to time constraints, which is a real shame because I can only imagine the wacky designs the developers could have come up with if they had the time and the resources. Next up, let's talk about one of the big selling points of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, the visuals. And yes, they are, of course, very nice to look at. The craziest part about it to me is that, as far as I'm aware, everything you see is in-engine, so even the cutscenes where I'd question whether or not I was watching a Pixar movie or playing a game are being rendered in real time, which is absolutely insane. But as we all know, the graphics can be the best in the world, but if the art direction isn't there, it'll still look mediocre. And I'm happy to say that is not the case with Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Like I said before, the areas are all extremely varied thanks to the planetary progression system of Rift Apart, and the designers took full advantage of this. Each world was so well crafted that there was never a question in my mind that this is a real living, breathing place. This is extremely impressive to me because of how varied the planets are from one another. I also really enjoy the artist's use of various vibrant colors throughout the game to make each area interesting to look at. There's always really bright colors like oranges and purples to keep your eyes entertained, and that just adds to the whole spectacle of the game. You know you've done something right when just looking at the game is fun. In terms of character designs, they are once again very nice. In particular, the new characters, namely Kit and Rivet, are very well designed. Rivet has her own unique identity while still resembling Ratchet enough to where it's believable that they would be related in some way. In particular, I like her color scheme of gray, as well as the various silver earrings she wears. It's a very appealing design. As for Kit, she does resemble Clank quite a bit, but the slight differences like her body shape and color once again make her a unique character. Personally, I really like the way she looks when she's on Ratchet or Rivet's back because of how round she is, and that's something that really set her apart from Clank in my opinion. And that's pretty much all there is to say about the visuals, but before we talk about the ending of the game, let's just very quickly talk about the music of Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Sadly, I didn't like it. Don't get me wrong, the music's fine, but it's just not memorable at all in my opinion. Every song just sounds like basic Marvel movie background music, and you know you don't go see a Marvel movie for the music. I just listened to the soundtrack before writing this, and I can confidently say I don't remember hearing 90% of those songs while playing the game. I usually have nothing but praise for video game music, but that's just not the case here. There is, however, one glimmer of hope in all this, and that is the credits song with the two Nefariouses. If you're a fan of old-style Disney movie songs like me, you'll absolutely adore this song in my opinion. The only bad part about it is that it's not animated as a real part of the game, but it's still a lot of fun. Okay, now for the ending, and once again, big spoiler warning, obviously. So, the general gist of things here is that Ratchet, Clank, Rivet, and Kit have rebuilt the Dimensionator, but Emperor Nefarious, and to a lesser degree Dr. Nefarious, have stolen it and used its power to invade Ratchet and Clank's dimension. We then follow him there, and the fighting commences. We blast our way through waves of Yolkians and a mini-boss or two, and we eventually find ourselves face-to-face with the dastardly duo of Nefariouses. But before we can smash them, they teleport away and Emperor Nefarious suits up into what he calls his power suit. This is the first of a few boss fights that lead us to the actual end of the game. As far as how the boss fights go, they're pretty fun, but basically what you'd expect for a last boss. You beat the robot's hands and head, then his heart, and finally have a showdown with Emperor Nefarious himself. The Nefarious fight is good, but it does reuse some mechanics here and there. The main thing for me here was the spectacle of it all, and that was definitely great. But anyway, after Rivet knocks out Emperor Nefarious, bringing back that line from the beginning of the game, he gets pulled into another dimension by a kraken, and Dr. Nefarious just kinda dies. And then this next part is probably my biggest problem with the ending. Clank just kinda knows how to fix the dimensions. He apparently learned how through the dimensional anomalies he's solved along the way, but it's never explained how he learned that or what he actually did to solve the dimensional calamity. I get that they couldn't really explain everything because it would probably just be a bunch of pseudoscientific mumbo-jumbo, but I would have still liked some sort of an explanation other than he just knew what to do. But anyway, the ending's alright. I wouldn't say it blew my mind or anything like that, but it was a lot of fun. So, let's go back to those few questions I posed at the beginning of the video. Does Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart live up to the hype? In my opinion, yes and no. The visuals are very high quality and full of vibrancy, combat is fluid and very satisfying, and I really enjoyed the relationship between Ratchet and Kit. However, the story overall was pretty predictable and clearly wanted to be a Marvel movie just a bit too much. The music was forgettable at best, and the game was too short to really flesh out the world it created. As for if I'd say this game is a console seller, I don't think it would be for me personally, but that's really going to be up to the individual. At the end of the day, I had a lot of fun with Rift Apart, but it's just a shame that it didn't quite get to the level that I hoped it would when it came to a few main aspects of the game. But anyway, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to watch all the way to the end of this very long review. It really means a lot to me. If you did happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks again for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out. For all you Gen Z kids out there, this is a Yolkian. They really do look exactly the same, don't they? Get it? Egg-zactly? Get it?